my colleagues, this Saturday is New York's 247th birthday. That's right, on April 20th, 1777, the state of New York ratified our first constitution after we declared independence in 1776. And as I have for several years now, I look forward to this day to talk about a chapter of our state's constitutional history that not only do I find interesting, but is relevant to the work that we do here in this chamber. And this year is no different. Now, we all know that one of Albany's favorite parlor games is to shake our fist at the clouds and lament how much power the governor has in the budget process. But did you know that it was not always this way? It was not until 1927 that the Constitution was amended to include the Article 7 budget process known as the executive budget. Before that, before 1927, the legislature had the power of the purse. So, ladies and gentlemen, gather around and hear the tale of how our state did persevere. Through trials and tribulations, we did find a way to reform our budget so refined. Our story begins with the Constitutional Convention of 1915, the zenith of the reform movement that was taking hold across the country in the wake of the progressive era that defined American politics from the 1890s to the 1920s. The goal of that convention was to modernize state government and create the architecture for the administrative state. During the prior century, the size and scope of state government was relatively small, so it didn't matter much if the legislature appropriated $1,000 for this, $2,000 for that, which at that time was still a lot of money. But as the state grew in population and also in revenue, it became painfully obvious that a better system was necessary. Between 1885 and 1914, the legislature approved expenditures that increased spending by 600% over that 30-year period, while revenue only grew by 274%. During the 1915 convention, a proposal was adopted to centralize the budget process in the executive branch and provide a framework for financial planning. As Henry Stimson, the future Secretary of State and Secretary of War, and the chairman of the Constitutional Convention's Committee on State Finances, Revenues, and Expenditures, so really a great committee, explained, the United States is substantially the only civilized country where, in both its national and state governments, a scientific budget system is unknown. No financial plan is presented to our legislature in public each year by men who are responsible for the conduct of government. No considered estimates of the future, no material whatsoever for comparison with the past is presented by our executives to the legislature in such a way that the body and the public can understand them and hold spenders of our public money responsible. Instead, our appropriation and revenue bills are made up in the comparative secrecy of legislative committees and rush through the final days of a legislative session. Now, there were 6 primary reasons why reform was so needed and why the legislature was not the appropriate branch of government to control the purse strings for the state. First, there was no centralized process to actually determine how much money each department, division, and office under state government needed to carry out its work. There was a state law passed in 1910 that required the comptroller to collect information from every department about what they needed to operate, but the comptroller had no ability to evaluate or revise what those proposals were. In practice, what that meant was every state government entity treated this process as a way to compile their wish list for more money, without needing to even justify what they wanted to spend their money on. Secondly, the legislature as an institution was simply not well structured to control the state's financial planning. Our purpose was to legislate. We had no administrative control over the offices of state government and therefore no ability to directly manage the administrative state. Additionally, as we all well know, crafting a budget is a delicate balance of advocating statewide spending priorities while all making sure that we can bring home enough bacon to our local districts. The track record of the legislature up to that point showed that the expenditures were approved based on the needs solely of individual members rather than the needs of the state as a whole. Thirdly, there was no process laid out anywhere, either in the legislature or with some outside authority, for a financial plan that measured expenses against projected revenues. This defect was incredibly problematic as the legislature routinely authorized spending that far exceeded the available budget to pay for it. In fact, in 1914, the legislature had to gavel back into special session to consider authorizing a tax of $18 million, which at that time represented 30% of the state's revenue for that whole year, just to cover a structural deficit. Fourthly, the legislature routinely used the appropriations process to engage in log rolling. You know, that trading favors back and forth to try to buy people's votes and win influence. And to make matters worse, the legislature would frequently pass standalone bills to appropriate money even outside of its own internal appropriations process. In 1915 alone, the legislature passed 17, I guess you'd call them supplemental appropriations bills, as local favors for individual members. A bridge in Waterloo, a footbridge in Seneca Falls, a school in Potsdam, a canal bridge in Yorkville, a new paved road in Lockport, and even a reimbursement to a private citizen for a personal expense he made to fix a local waterway, just to name a couple of examples. Fifth, as the size of the budget grew and grew, it became more difficult for the legislature to pretend to manage its finances responsibly. Partly out of complexity of the size of the budget, but partly out of political considerations, the legislature would authorize expenses that they knew were ridiculously high, but they expected the governor to use his discretion to administratively reduce how much would actually be spent for any given purpose. This allowed individual legislators to score a political win by securing passage of an appropriation that benefited their own parochial interests, all while knowing that the money might never actually be spent. In some ways, it's not unlike our own one-house budget process, right, where we all put our biggest budget hopes and dreams forward, only to see them get whittled down by the end of the day. And the last major defect of the status quo was simply the lack of transparency. The appropriations bills were drafted solely by the respective financial chairpersons in each chamber. As one delegate to the Constitutional Convention complained, at the present time, the work is carried on in quiet by the chairman of the two finance committees. The legislature knows nothing about it. The people know nothing about it. The press know nothing about it until the report of the committee nears the close of the session. Then there is scant time for deliberation, and it's too late to criticize and do it all over again. Now, the 1915 convention proposed replacing this chaotic system with something more professional and orderly, a centralized process where financial estimates for the necessary operation of the various departments of state government were put together alongside a financial plan that detailed the projected incoming revenue the state could authorize to spend. Importantly, this centralized authority was to be given to the governor, because the governor had the constitutional duty to enforce the laws of the state, and functionally speaking, the expense of state funds through various state departments was how a great deal of those laws were to be put into effect. Now, although the convention ultimately adopted the executive budget amendment, the debate was wild, and believe you me, I spent hours reading through these transcripts, and it was wild, and generated strong opposition from delegates to the convention who were also members of the legislature. One delegate, who we can confidently say deserves an award for legislative hyperbole, asserted, "The legislature is being destroyed, and if it is being destroyed, I want to be the old Cato that calls attention to it. That stern old Cato that calls attention to the fact that the power of the direct representatives of the people of the state is being gradually taken away and is being tucked off down in the corner of the second story of the building here." As we all know, our second floor. Nevertheless, led by the leader of the Progressive Reform Movement, Assembly member and future Governor Al Smith, the convention passed the amendment and sent the proposal to the people for a public referendum, along with several other proposed amendments. And then the public voted against it. So although the amendment failed to garner public ratification, the push for budget reform continued. In 1916, Governor Charles Whitman sought to consolidate all of the budget requests from state agencies and then held a series of public hearings around the state about the budget before submitting a tentative spending plan for the legislature's consideration. And although this effort won him considerable praise from the press and New York's reform leaders, the legislature was simply not impressed, arguing that the governor's actions would only confuse the public, who were accustomed to the legislature having direct control of the budget. However, in a sign of how the tide was starting to turn, the legislature that year managed to adopt a budget which, as it turned out, was very similar to what Governor Whitman originally proposed. The following year, our legislature adopted the Sage-Meyer Act, which proposed some modest budget reforms, but cemented the authority for the budget process firmly with the legislative branch. The Sage-Meyer Act gave clear responsibility to the financial committees in each chamber to lead the budget drafting process, allowed each committee to hire full-time budget staff for the first time, and importantly, authorized the governor to submit to the legislature a suggested budget for the legislature's consideration. Despite this progress, by 1920, that process fell apart, and the legislature went back to routinely ignoring the Sage-Meyer Act, the very law that they passed themselves, and disregard the governor's input. With the election of Governor Al Smith, however, the reform effort took on new life, and Smith committed himself to see through the reforms that he helped propose a decade earlier. Finally, in 1927, under the threat of Smith calling the legislature into special session every day until they acquiesced to budget reform, the legislature approved a constitutional amendment formalizing the executive budget process, along with legislation to hire full-time executive staff to manage the state's finances, which created the Division of Budget. The amendment was ratified by the public a year later, and in 1929, New York State adopted its first executive budget. With the adoption of Article 7 to the Constitution, New York became one of the first states, and still to this day, one of only a handful of states, to enshrine a formal budget process in its state constitution. Now, throughout the years, Article 7 has been modified slightly, but at its core, it remains the same: a process for the financial management of the state's affairs that is anchored firmly in the executive branch. And so, my colleagues, as we sit here today waiting to finish this year's budget, just know that things used to be very, very different. And arguably, from a governance perspective, maybe a little worse. The state budget was anything but an actual budget, and it took years and years before the winds of change brought about actual reform. Now, you might be wondering, I haven't even touched on Silver v. Pataki, which I know brings often more ire from those of us in this chamber at the budget process, but that'll have to wait for another Constitution Day. So with that, Madam President, I say happy birthday, New York, happy Constitution Day, and I vote aye. Thank you.